1913 had been a bad year. Cotton prices had dropped to gut level. Farms had folded. And if you were a black man, the future held only a mirror on the times. For Oklahoma was changing. A generation before, black men had helped rule this land. Those who started in slavery became judges, marshals, mayors. One became an Indian chief. Others were cowboys, cavalry, and homesteaders. They helped carve a wilderness. But statehood brought new power, and overnight, black men were told where to sit, and where to walk, and when to learn. For those who had come west with the frontier spirit, it was a bitter, lonely ride into the future. The people gathered in Walika as Indian summer left its colors across the land. They had heard of the man in the hills, left their farms, their tools, took only their dreams. For $25, he had said, he would take them back to Africa. It was a siren song that drew more than 1,000 people to that tiny town on the North Canadian.
Chief Sam, he sold the Negro on the idea of going back to Africa. And he would tell them such stories as over in Africa, they had trees over there that was growing flapjacks. Now, a lot of the young ones don't know what flapjacks are, but they're hotcakes. They grew flapjacks and said all you had to do was just reach up and get you a flapjack, and said they had streams of molasses running, and go down and sop some molasses. And a lot of Negroes, they sold their homes and sold their farms, or practically give them away.
All winter they waited. All spring. Chief Sam had gone to New York to get a boat to take them back. But with each day that passed, savings dwindled. Dysentery and typhoid ran rampant, and the situation became desperate. Finally, on June 18, 1914, the critics were silent. The SS Liberia sailed into Galveston Harbor. Oklahoma's pilgrims were on their way home. Of the thousands who bought tickets, only 60 were aboard that first voyage. But most who were left behind still believed, still had faith that next time they too would go. It took 3 months to reach the coast of Africa, and while the ship was on the high seas, the last of the faithful left the camps, this time with no money and no property. Those aboard the Liberia fared little better. They were stopped en route by a British man of war and forced to lay to for 45 days. By the time they resumed their voyage, the ship's food supplies had run out, and so had Chief Sam's money. But they made it. The Americans were well received by Sam's people, but they found the living primitive. And while there was land available, Chief Sam didn't own it, and no one else had money to buy. A few Oklahomans stayed on the Gold Coast. A few went to Liberia with Chief Sam, who later became a cocoa buyer. But most came back again to Oklahoma. Ironically, 3 years later, diamonds were discovered on the land they had sought in Africa. They had not found their dreams on the Gold Coast, nor did they find them on the return to Oklahoma, which by this time had restricted their voting, their office holding, their education, and even the areas where they could live. frustrations of a decade found their flashpoint in Tulsa, the worst race riot in the history of the state. Most historians now agree the Holocaust was begun by a ruffian element on both sides. But riots have a way of getting out of hand. No one stops to ask who is innocent.
I sat up all night. Dr. Wickham lived right across the street from me, and they would bring the wounded there for him to dress the wounds. And then they would tear right out again, and I couldn't tell. And finally someone a girl went to the door, and oh, she says, Miss Lynch, come and see the people that are in our backyard. And then it just looked like pandemonium reigned supreme.
More than 85 people were killed. Hundreds left homeless. The battle swept over Tulsa's north side for more than a day.
I lived on Elgin Street, Elgin and Haskell, and they were coming from the railroad track, which was on Cincinnati, and they didn't cross the railroad track. That was what the Negroes were trying to keep them from doing until their ammunition gave out. They didn't cross that track. But after the ammunition gave out, well then, of course, they came on across.
Tulsa's north side had been one of the most prosperous black communities in America. Now, its showcase held only rubble.
The lady that lived with me, her daughter-in-law and son lived out in the addition, what we call the addition. And we thought we'd go out there. And when we got out there, she was, the daughter-in-law was, she had been up to her brother. She said, well, there ain't no need to stop in here. She said, because they're coming out here. I came back a few days later, my lot was as clean as this floor. I mean, there wasn't a leaf, anything on there. And I had trees and flowers, grapevines, but everything was gone. There wasn't a thing that just as clean as this floor.
The rest of the state had its share of violence, too. This was the era of the Ku Klux Klan. Night riders, lynchings, violent deaths. Parts of Oklahoma were placed under martial law, and Oklahoma's 5th governor felt it necessary to position armed guards around the Capitol to keep the legislature from meeting. John Walton was later impeached for what many felt was his excessive struggles with the Ku Klux Klan, some of whom were in that legislature. But the real struggle for civil rights did not take place in the streets. It was in the courts that black men fought and finally won back freedom. It was not an easy struggle. It would take 50 years. But the times produced a man to lead.
Roscoe Dungy started out here as a youngster selling vegetables on the street to make a living for his family, and he saw the plight of black people in Oklahoma. Prior to the early 20s, most Negroes in Oklahoma City stayed south of 2nd Street. A shoemaker, William Floyd, bought a piece of property at Northeast 2nd at Central Street and attempted to occupy that property. But each time that he went into the property, the sheriff's officers went out there and arrested him. They arrested him 5 times in one day, and Roscoe Dungy bailed him out each time and told him to go back to his house. We got that case into the federal courts, which were then up in Guthrie rather than here in Oklahoma City. And after much adjudication, we won that case. From then, Negroes started migrating northeast till we got to 8th Street, and that's where we had some more difficulty. Of course, between Northeast 2nd and 8th, we had a few bombings. Just within a block of my office here, a colored lady by the name of Mrs. Maxwell's house was bombed because she occupied it. When we got to 8th Street, and during the tenure of Governor Bill Murray, the governor drew a line down Northeast 8th Street and said that all Negroes must stay or rent property or own property south of 8th Street, and that whites could stay anywhere north of 8th Street. Roscoe Dungy tried numerous persons who had purchased property up there to get them into court. The courts would use rather dilatory manners in that they would go out and arrest people but never bring the case to trial. Finally, we got a man, Sidney Hawkins, who was a school janitor here in Oklahoma City, who had a piece of property out on 8th Street, to agree to go all the way.
The first morning they came to arrest him, they said, they knocked on the door, and I went to the door, and they said, "Is your husband in?" And I said, "Yes." So, "Well, may we speak to him?" And I said, "Yes." And I went and called him. He's eating breakfast. And I called him, and they said, "Well, we got," he says, "Who is it?" I said, "It's the policeman." He said, "Well, what do they want?" I said, "I don't know. Come see." And he come to the door, and they told him that they were there to arrest him because he was living in an all-white neighborhood. That's all they could say to him. And they arrested him. There was a neighbor living on the east of us, and she didn't want to look over on my porch whatsoever. But she bought her a canvas. She went somewhere and got her, you know, one of these canvases like they like to use a tent like. Well, she got one of those and put up on the west side of her porch, keeping looking on me, because I was west to her and she was east to me. When I'd wash my clothes, I'd have to go hang them on a line and sit out there until they got dry to bring them in. If it didn't, they'd throw mud all up on them. I'll come and just throw them down, pull them down, and then run. But I never did get frightened. I say if I have to die for something that will help my generation of the black people, when I'm dead and gone, it wouldn't make any difference with me. And that's the way I feel now, which I love everybody. I'd do just as much for you as I would for him. I'd nurse you just like I would him. It wouldn't make any difference with me. I'd give you just as much as I'd give him. That's what's on the inside of me. You know, on the outside don't count. The things on the inside is the thing that counts. And I'm telling you, you got to be mighty big. You got to be mighty big to say that. A woman 6, 8 years old, and I mean every word of it.
Ralph Ellison played along the broken path that was 2nd Street. As a little boy, he heard the bands on Deep Deuce. And he would grow up to write of his city and his time. What he wrote would be called the most distinguished piece of literature in the last 20 years.
My own parents, like most of the other Negro parents, had come to the new state looking for broader freedom, and they never stopped pressing against the barriers. Now, most parents wish their children to have no contact with the cotton patch because it was part of an experience which they wanted to put behind them. It was part of the old South which they had come west to forget. But just the same, those trips to the cotton patch seemed to me an enviable experience because the kids came back with such wonderful stories. It wasn't the hard work which they stressed, but the communion, the playing, the eating and the dancing and the singing. And they brought back such good jokes, our kind of Negro jokes, not those told about Negroes by whites. And they always returned with Negro folk stories which I'd never heard before, and which I couldn't find in any of the books that I knew. I didn't think too much about it, but what my schoolmates shared in the country seemed to me to be much more real than many of the Negro middle class values which we were being taught in school. Now, I recognized limitations, yes, but I thought these limitations were unjust, and I felt no innate sense of inferiority that would keep me from getting those things that I desired out of life. There were those who stood in the way, but despite them, you just had to keep moving toward whatever it was you wanted. As a kid, I remember working it out this way, that there was a world in which you wore your everyday clothes on Sunday, and there was a world in which you wore your Sunday clothes every day. I wanted the world in which you wore your Sunday clothes every day.
Ada Lois Sipuel was wearing her Sunday best when yellow sun mixed with fog on a cold January day. It was 1946, and she was heading south into the history books.
On the appointed day, we met at the offices of the Black Dispatch, a cloudy, overcast, rather humid day, as I remember, and simply made the drive to Norman, went directly to the administration building. It was during the January enrollment, so there was quite a crowd in the hall. They were so surprised to see us come in that they sort of stood to the side, and we were able to walk immediately to the enrollment counter. Mr. Dungy had called Dr. Cross a few minutes before we came down to tell him that we would be down. So Dr. Cross was waiting and available in his office.
It would take a Philadelphia lawyer to prove to me that it costs more to run one school system than it would to run two. And one of the terrible things about segregation has been its shameful cost.
Dr. Cross then turned to Mr. Dungy and said she's qualified in every respect except that she is Negro. And under the laws of the state of Oklahoma, I will, for that reason, have to deny her admission. Mr. Dungy then asked if Dr. Cross would be willing to put his statement into her letter, which he did. I went through the district court of Cleveland County, where I lost, the state Supreme Court, where I lost, the United States Supreme Court, where I won.
Ada Lois Sipuel opened the door, and millions of black youngsters across the country would follow her lead. But equal still meant separate, and it would be 6 more years before the court would change all that. In 1954, separate but equal became the same.
When we sit side by side in the same classrooms, learning the same thing at the very same time with students of all races and all nationalities, I think it will be a great step toward Christianity and brotherhood throughout the world.
Possibly at first there will be some trouble, and I agree that a lot of it will come from the parents. I don't think most of the kids would mind going to school with Negroes. I certainly wouldn't.
I feel that such a thing would have come to pass anyway, and we're finally realizing our dream.
And I believe if I had my preference, I'd rather not, but since we have to, I guess I can learn to like it.
I'd like to say that I'm very happy concerning the Supreme Court's ruling today, and I agree with the panel also. I'm sure that this will bring about a better understanding between the different racial groups, and if we realize that communism always dwells on the question that America does not provide equal educational opportunities, well, it can no longer hang on this fact, because now we will have equal opportunities.
And I think it'd be okay if they did, because there are very many fine Negro athletes, and I think if the whites and the Negroes were mixed together, they'd come up with some very fine teams.
Now, my notion is that the decision goes farther. than just the question of separate schools. I think this, if the court holds that segregation is discrimination, it follows that any type of segregation, whether it be on buses or trains or in hotels or rooming houses or wherever, there has been an effort on the part of state government to make distinction based on race. I think the court has outlawed that. Now, of course, we may have to go in court to implement that idea into the decisions with special cases, but I think in the end that the court is going to rule that it has made one great American family and an actual melting pot out of the people who constitute the population in the United States.
But segregation in restaurants and hotels and swimming pools was largely by custom, not law. Had it been by law, court cases could have ended it. But this time, the courts could not provide the answer. Other means were found. The tactic was the sit-in. Oklahoma City was one of the first in the country to feel its effect.
I would like to go with some facts with you. Oklahoma has always been a leader in the field of human relations. And the battlefield, the civil rights battlefield, has been fought here in Oklahoma, and we have taken more cases to the Supreme Court than any other state in the history of America. And we have been able to do it because of the fact that the whites and colors have worked together.
Freedom, freedom.
In order to bring about changes, real changes, I think we have to go back to the scripture, which teaches us plainly that a little child shall lead them. With this philosophy, then, we use children. And two, we were working through a movement, and in a movement, it's just like in the army. You've got to have people that are well trained. So if we had not had trained youth, we would have had violence, and we could not afford violence at this point in history. You cannot win with violence. And we were not only talking about winning the right to eat in a restaurant or to sleep in a hotel, but we were talking about winning a revolution where the white man, who certainly needed help in seeing what America was all about, would be in a position so after the sit-in movement, we could continue to progress, where if we had used some other tactics, we could not have progressed. I think one thing really sticks out in my memory. It's the attitude that I had toward Mrs. Johnny Brown. From 1957 to 1961, I think, I tried to see Mrs. Brown and could not. Finally, I received a call from her secretary in which I was invited to see her. And during the time, I was thinking, what could I say to this woman who more or less had my future and the future of my people in her hands and who had not done anything with it? When I arrived at the store, and especially in Mrs. Brown's office, my whole attitude toward her changed. Because standing there in the office alone, I saw her as another woman who was deeply in love with her husband, because everything in the office was just like it was before he died. And when she arrived, in place of our having any harsh things to say, we ended up in each other's arms, crying. And Mrs. Brown and I became very good friends. In 1963, my sorority honored me, and she was one of the first ones to send me an orchid and to congratulate me. She offered me an opportunity to go to Europe with her as her guest that I had to turn down because of other business. But Mrs. Johnny Brown and Clara Luper were very good friends, and I had the highest amount of respect for her. The thing that hurt me most about the sit-in movement was not the fact that I went to jail 23 times, nor the fact that once a man spit in my face and some of the other injustices that I suffered. But it was the day that I found out that Spring Lake Park was open. I was so happy because as a mother, I used to take my children by there and wanted to take them to Spring Lake Park. So when I found out it was open, I immediately contacted my daughter and said, Marilyn, I would like to take you to Spring Lake Park. At that time, Calvin was in Washington, where he had the opportunity to work for a summer. But then Marilyn looked at me and said, Mom, I want to go to Spring Lake Park, but I would rather go with some of my friends. And I realized that although I'd spent my life trying to open up Spring Lake Park, that I would never have the pleasure of taking my own children to the park. So really everything that I had done was too late. And now as I go to Spring Lake Park and as I see a mother with her children, I feel a sense of gratitude that these mothers would be able to experience what I would never experience.
Really and truly, if anybody had told me that the times would ever be as they are now, I wouldn't have believed it. Because I thought the time would come, but I thought it would be 100, 150 years before we would have gotten where we are now. And I don't know, I just think, I sit down and think of the difference in the attitude of the races. Now, that doesn't mean that all, because there are bad people in my race just like they're bad in yours. But the majority of them, they seem to have come to the conclusion that the Negro is people.